I'll start with when, as in like when were women being murdered in the German sex trade. The time frame that I look at mostly is the last 20 years. So for the last 20 years, we've really had the official position from our government. Sex trade is an acceptable part of our economy, our society, etc. Brothel keeping, profiting off of another person's sex trade, sex buying and selling, these are all legal with some rules and regulations put on it. And then I also look at the 20 years prior so that we have a little bit of comparison. And I should say in those 20 years prior, prostitution was in a little bit of limbo. It wasn't as accepted as it is now, both socially and legally, but it was still pretty prevalent and partially legal. So that makes it a little bit more complex to compare those two time periods, but that's roughly what I'm doing. So for the last 20 years, Germany has averaged about 8 murders or attempted murders of women in prostitution per year. And the actual number is probably considerably higher because it's tricky to identify reliably if a victim was in the sex trade or not. Because even when the sex trade is legal, and even now for the few years that we've had mandatory registration, there's still a lot of women, well, you don't know for sure, were they selling sex or maybe they were just doing it part-time. It's hard to identify, both if a murder victim was in prostitution and also because a lot of these women do live in a parallel society. A lot of them are not registered anywhere. Or they might be like really socially isolated migrant women. A woman turns up dead and nobody knows who she is. So there are Jane Does who are among these cases, of course. So sometimes when people in the sex trade go missing, this doesn't necessarily alert authorities. And also, a lot of cases are kept confidential until they're solved. So there might be a lot of ongoing investigations that we just don't know about. When it comes to the attempted murders, we know that in the general population, it's hard for women to report everything from rape to domestic violence to a pimp, a trafficker, and the same goes. We can assume that there are a lot of women, and I certainly know a lot of survivors who had near-death experiences and they just never told anyone, never mind the police. So these numbers, when I say in 8 cases, that doesn't sound like a lot. It is probably more. I can't tell you how much, but it's probably more. So overall, the information available is insufficient to make a definitive statement about an increase or decrease of lethal violence due to the 2002 liberalization law. I just want to be careful about that and not claim like, oh, we know it got worse or it got better. We don't know. We don't have enough numbers. And why doesn't our government collect these numbers? At least, the police stations could coordinate with each other the same way that we're trying to track or starting to track other crimes. Although, as far as I know, we're not good in Germany overall tracking crimes against women and children. Well, in the case of prostitution, there's a very specific reason, because that would further stigma. If we say that prostitution is exceptionally dangerous, then somehow society ends up viewing women as less. Those are the mental gymnastics that people do. German Bureau of Criminal Investigation says it will not track these murders. That could stigmatize the profession, which is, I think, absolutely insane. So we don't know the murder rate in Germany overall. We have some numbers. There was one study done in the US that tracked women in prostitution and found that women in prostitution are murdered at 18 times of a comparable sample of the general population. So again, these are American numbers, not German, but it wouldn't surprise me if the rate was higher in Germany as well. Though I can't prove that for certain, numbers from other countries would indicate that. And in the US, that means that so-called workplace homicide, if you compare to other occupations, like being a liquor store worker or a taxi driver or even a soldier, women in the sex trade are still murdered at considerably higher rates than those groups. Moving on, I want to talk about the perpetrator. So first thing is 100% of the killings involved a male perpetrator. Sometimes men acted in pairs or groups, and there are a few cases where they had a female accomplice. So 2 or 3, as I remember it. Yeah, so most of the perpetrators were men, and these are men of all ages. I actually found that the mean age of victims and perpetrators was the same. It was 33 years. And the youngest killer was just 18 and the oldest 61. There's US-based research that says the same thing. The average age of murderers in prostitution context is just men in their early 30s. And almost all the killers were of German nationals. There are a few cases of migrants and foreign criminal gangs, but it's mostly German men. And most of these men were completely sober. Some of them did take drugs or were drunk, but most of them were completely sober. And the biggest commonality between the killers is the fact that about half of them were sex buyers, were Johns. And this again mirrors international research. This includes both first-time sex buyers, so this is a man that she's never met before, as well as regulars, including of up to 10 years. So that's a regular is the John who keeps going to the same woman. There might even be some level of trust. This may be a generous word, but there's at least some level of familiarity. We are often told those women who establish regulars, they're comparatively safer. But there are quite a few of those regulars in there. So that's a man who has invested a lot of money again and again and again. And he starts the same way that a very possessive boyfriend acts. He starts feeling, well, that woman is kind of my property. That's not a dynamic that women escape in the sex trade at all. You get the worst of both worlds. You get the dangerous stranger and the man who seems somewhat familiar, but he's holding that familiarity over you to enact power and up to homicide. And there's also a debate on whether men who pose as sex buyers but are actually just trying to rob her or rape her, and they don't actually want to pay for, they belong in this category. And I should say, when I broke down the numbers, I was, I guess, generous in that I didn't count those men. I counted them separately. But I think we just have remembering the fundamental dynamics of how the sex trade works. It lets men into women's apartments, or it makes them get women climb into their cars, and it doesn't really matter why he was there in front of the door or he was there with his car. There's no way for her to tell for sure what his plans are with her, and that is a fundamentally dangerous situation, like no matter what, no matter the legislation. So again, the high rate of sex buying perpetrators in these homicide cases is affirmed by international research, and there's also one study, the one study that our government did do into the sex trade, a detailed one from the family ministry that said that 78% of women in the sex trade experienced fear for their safety because of a sex buyer, and 41 reported having experienced physical or sexual violence in a prostitution context. I have a quote here from a German homicide detective, Jürgen Schmidt. He says, "The first suspect in a prostitution case is always the most recent John." That's how it works. So I'm not making that up, that sex buyers commit most of these murders, or that women fear. They're literally alone in a room with a man, not sure if he might kill them tonight. Men from all walks of life murder women in prostitution. Again, we had all ages, all types of living situations, all occupations. I think this is important because you'll see that mirrored in other types of violence against women. There's not one profile. These men are anybody's. So yeah, we have members of organized crime. We have homeless men, unemployed men, asylum seekers, waiters, office workers, doctors, soldiers, ex-policemen. We have men with mental handicaps. We have cold calculated killers, Nazis, liberal men, labor left, single men, married men. One man committed it while on his honeymoon. Many are fathers. Some were still in high school, and some lived in retirement. So literally anybody. There's no definitive profile. So it's not like she, peeks into the car, or he's at the door and she can see, oh, he's got a scar, he's got tattoos, he's got to be one of the dangerous ones. There's literally no way to tell. Same as with any other type of violence against women. One occupational group stands out. That's a discriminate number of serial murders who were truck drivers. And I absolutely don't want to disparage truck drivers in general. There's even, I know several organizations who are truck drivers against trafficking. But, men traveling relatively anonymously who keep crossing borders into other countries. So they can rob, rape, or murder a woman, and then very quickly they're very far away. Right? Don't want to disparage the entire profession, but it's the convenience of the job that enables it. And they often target the most vulnerable women. So women next to highways or in so-called lavmobiles. These are like mini brothels next to highways. And these are very, often far away from the city. Women are pretty isolated. It's really, really dangerous. The second group after sex buyers, so about every 10th woman was killed by someone who was profiting off of her. So I would call that a pimp. Legally, they might qualify as a trafficker, but since pimping, as long as it isn't violent, is legal in Germany, legally they might not be considered a pimp, but I consider everyone who profits off of someone else in the sex trade knowingly and substantively a pimp. This is probably not news. Pimps are not commonly protectors of women in the sex trade. They're often the biggest danger to her. They might sometimes defend her from a violent John, but at the end of the day, they're there to control her and to maximize their own income. And these are both individual men, a woman, or multiple under their control, and again, members of organized crime. We're going to go into a lot more, but even just the information up until now, I really wish this was common knowledge in and abroad, because I feel like conversations that we have about prostitution would be very different if we asked ourselves this basic question: in what other occupation is your most likely killer your customer or your boss? And how can we possibly accept these as occupational hazards? Continuing the information about these men, we do have a number of them, not surprisingly. It's not their first victim. There are serial rapists, men who batter their partners. There are several cases of men out on day parole when they commit the murder. So some of you might have heard there was a woman murdered in Quebec in Canada by a man out on parole, and that case made international headlines. Every life lost matters, but I was like, why do we hear about this case, but this has happened several times in Germany and nobody knows about it? There's an imbalance there. A number had a documented history of torturing animals. Again, that's probably in general like killer or serial killer profile behavior, not so unusual. But we also have men who are, by all the information that we have, completely upstanding citizens, like a clean record, right? Again, a lot of married men, fathers, men who are doing well in society. About 1 in 5 women were murdered by a current or former partner, and this is a bit complicated because a lot of these partners are also pimps or sex buyers, and then if you don't have the details about the relationship, can you even call it a partner, or is it really, just pimping? When I broke down the data, I did sort these men into the pimp and sex buyer category rather than partner because it was just too difficult to untangle. And a lot of these are not some kind of equal relationship. It's just an extension of exploitation. So in cases where a married former sex buyer killed his partner, he was usually significantly older than her, often several decades. She was often from impoverished migrant background, and this is just, a form of social and economic dependence, as we see in the phenomenon of so-called mail order brides. And yet other men are what's known in Germany as lover boys. I don't know if you use the same term internationally. So that's a pimp who will fake love and fake a relationship to keep a woman emotionally dependent on him for as long as she's profitable. And then there was really a scarily high number of these men were serial killers. About every 4th woman was murdered by a serial killer, many of whom were also prolific sex buyers. So again, keeping these categories separate is tricky, but I did separate the serial killers into their own category. And again, according to the homicide detective that I quoted earlier, when authorities investigate prostitution-related murder, they will always look for previous and consequent cases by the same killer. Because serial killers targeting women in sex trade is just normal, basically. So every few years, again, like this should be public knowledge in prostitution, every few years in Germany, there's a serial killer. We often also call them rippers. They will murder several women in the German sex trade, but there isn't a lot of reporting about it. There isn't a lot of public interest. And if it's there, it's the tabloids being sensationalist, and the rest of society is asleep. I don't know the exact reasons for this. This might have to do with like media conventions in Germany. Of course, the reporting can be exploitative, prying into the victim's personal life. That does happen. We don't want to encourage that. There's got to be a way to report about these that's serious, that's dignified towards the victim, that's oriented towards raising awareness, solutions, etc. I also understand, ongoing cases, you can't report about them too much. You can't give away the police work, but still, we have rippers in Germany all the time, and people just don't know about it. And I think that does signal to women in the sex trade that they don't matter. Because when these happened, I think was it Nuremberg, where there was one not that long ago? Like, just the tabloids that were interviewing women would quote them as saying, like, we're scared, we're terrified. And there are all these women in that city or that area terrified, and the rest of society is just unaware. The data here confirms that serial killers targeting women in the sex trade, it's not a cliche, it's just reality. I'm going to move on to talking about the victims. Again, I don't want to feed into any of that. If the woman just behaves a little differently, then this won't happen to her. Like, I don't want to feed into any of that. This is more to remember these women, not as faceless, but, a little more concrete. Who were they? What are their lives like? So it's about that. It's not about saying, if you don't fall into these categories that I'll mention, then, it's fine. It's actually one of the strongest learning experiences for me was to say, wow, okay, actually the women are quite diverse as well. And it's not like there's this sector of the sex trade that's super safe. And if you're just in that good part, then you're fine. And it's not going to happen to you. Okay, so nearly all of the victims were women. There is one disappearance of a young man in prostitution, assumed to be murdered in 2004. And then there was a serial murder of boys in the 80s. There are about 4 trans women also murdered, since the early 80s. But because most of the victims are female, I'm just going to refer to victims as women, but men and boys are included under that. So again, victims are of all ages, right? Some of these victims are children. The youngest were 2 boys of 14, and the oldest was a woman of 65. And some of these victims are still in high school. Some of them are moms, pregnant women, and some women are old enough to be grandmothers. And the mean age, just as the killer, was around 33 years. I think it's important to highlight that a significant number of women are in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. So we do know that the prostitute population is younger than the average population, but there's still a lot of middle-aged women in the trade. And about half of women in German prostitution are mothers, right? They're trying to feed a family. Often that family is back in their home country. When women are killed, they leave behind children who have to cope with the trauma of losing a mother to violence. A number of these women had lost custody to the father, parents, grands, or foster family. That's another topic to maybe discuss another time. I've wanted to write and talk about motherhood and prostitution for a long time because it's really difficult. Some of these women are living in really dangerous circumstances where probably removal of the children is warranted. But I also agree that the stigma that every woman who is selling sex is inherently a bad mother, a lot of people think that way unfairly, I believe, that, you know, she might lose her kids quicker if it's found out that she's selling sex, even though many try really, really hard to make sure that their kids don't see any of that, don't notice any of that, don't feel the repercussions. And many of these women, where we do know their own histories, they often did lose one or both of their parents to prison, suicide, or other kinds of early separation or death. So less than half, but a really large group nonetheless, were first sexually exploited as children. I mean, these are mirroring the same statistics that we have about women in general, but it's reflected in these cases. The majority experienced some level of childhood neglect or abuse. That one family ministry study that we have on the lived realities of women confirms that. A number of victims entered the sex trade later in life because they'd fallen on hard times. So after they got divorced, a marriage ended, and they had nothing. That still happens to women in Germany, or they lost the job, or they became disabled and weren't supported enough. And some of these women were in prostitution for decades. Again, like anyone who envisions, you know, prostitution makes the average woman wealthy, and she's just in there for a few years and then she's out. A lot of these women get stuck in these cases until death for years or decades. And it is true that killers do look for someone vulnerable, you know, women who are socially isolated, etc. But there are more extreme forms where women are homeless, they're struggling with alcohol or drug addiction, they are noticeably, significantly, visibly ill, or they have mental health problems. So there were a number of cases of women intoxicated when they were climbing into men's cars, etc. Again, it's not a cliche. The data just shows us over and over. In order to cope with the fear and the abuse that's normal for women in sex trade, high rates of substance use, addicting substances is normal. And again, I have a quote from a German police detective who talks about this, like, what's, bringing it back to the perpetrator, what's wrong with men that they see this distress and they don't care, or worse, he says, there are sex buyers who will even get horny when the woman is HIV positive and covered in wounds. I recently started reading some US American forums of John's as well, and on my first day looking into it, I find this quote of a man talking about a woman who he says, because he used to work in an HIV clinic, he says, this woman has AIDS and she's wasting away. But instead of being like, hey, here's where you can get treatment, he attempts to buy her. There are men like that. I can't put a number on how many sex buyers are like that, but enough for there to be, an industry around that. And I should also emphasize, when the sex trade is legal, there are no laws preventing these men from legally purchasing access to women who are in that level of visible distress. If any of us was in a situation where we were in such danger, we too would probably start drinking or something. Let's be real. That's not some kind of weakness that you need to professionalize women out of. We have to ask ourselves, why are men seeking out women who are so severely incapacitated? So one change that we can observe over time, so from the 80s until today, is that we see an ever-increasing number of women who are migrants, until migrants start to outnumber local women. This is again confirmed by government data from 2019, which puts the number of licensed migrants in the sex trade is at 81%. And the actual number would probably be higher because this is just the licensed women. So while in the 80s and 90s, the majority of murder victims are German, this reverses in the 00s and the 2010s. And this is not just because we liberalized our prostitution laws, it's also due to EU expansion, and it became easier both for impoverished women to travel to Germany as well for trafficking rings to exploit them, because they could legally bring them into the country. So for the last 20 years, a huge number of 43% are Eastern European, primarily Romanian, Bulgarian, Polish, Ukrainian, 12% from Asia, predominant high, 6% African, 4% Latin American, and then just 4% Western Southern European. Not surprising, and again reflecting the general prostitute population. Most of these places of origin are significantly poorer than Germany. So poverty is one undeniable factor that leads into the sex trade. It's not the only one, but it's a pretty strong one. We do know from the information of these cases that a number of women were trafficked by force or by fraud, by false promises of work in Germany, right, as a waitress, a cleaner, a nanny. But some women come, and this is where government and the Johns like to say, well, they chose it, they came here on volition. But I would think they'd be more accurately classed as economic refugees, especially in parts of Eastern Europe. Like there's a level of poverty where people don't even have tap water, right? They don't have sewage systems in some cases. And women and girls sometimes can't even finish their primary education. So the level of poverty that a lot of Germans can hardly imagine, but really should, because it's relevant here. Many of these women are feeding their entire families back home. Some of these families know where the money's coming from, many don't. Some of these families do sometimes act as pimps, but many have no idea. And here's one example of a woman. Her name was Christina. She was 25 from Romania. And her case highlights what this violence costs entire families. Shortly after, Christina was murdered by a regular, so a long-term customer, who was registered with her German escort agency. Her older sister, also in the sex trade, vanished, and police presume it was another murder case. So that's who lost 2 daughters into prostitution. There are families sacrificing daughters, knowingly, unknowingly, sometimes multiple of them for one family, into the sex trade in Western Europe so they can make ends meet. And there are some Romanian feminists, I link an article in my blog post that has started to describe this phenomenon as a genocide. It's not for me to put that label on it, but there are feminists from these countries who have started to call it that. Overall, the biographies of victims indicate that most women killed in German prostitution were not making a free choice to enter the trade, but engaged in it due to lack of choices, if not outright force. And many victims were trying to leave prostitution or had tried it before. But ultimately, it does not matter to the killer who she is. The idea that a high degree of choice or perceived glamour makes women safe is an illusion. And I have a few cases here too. There's an example, we like to talk about, some women, they throw away good opportunities to enter the sex trade. In this case, we don't know why, but she decided to enter prostitution instead of continue her training as an assistant radiologist. And she was murdered on her second day in prostitution by a sex buyer in an apartment brothel shared with multiple women. The killer does not care why she's there. It's irrelevant to him if she really did think this was better than something else or not. Another case is as a dominatrix. I also don't like this division of women. The dominatrixes are somehow privileged because we envision them, beating up men. They're stronger than men or some variation of that. No, dominatrixes are among the murdered too. And here's one example of a woman who she had her own studio, right? She was independent. She was in control by all standards of the sex work crowd. She was an independent sex worker, and she was murdered in her own studio by a regular customer of 10 years. And I've also written about this false narrative that high-class escorting is somehow safe or glamorous or something. I wrote a whole blog post just about that. You can find it on my blog as well. Plenty of women with no pimp, some with other options, many with experience in the sex trade. None of these keep them safe because the killers just don't care why she's there. That's not important. So I'm now talking about the location of these cases. Where is it happening? There is no such thing as a safe sex trade venue. We often hear, street prostitution, outdoor, that's statistically more dangerous. That's true. But still, well, first of all, most prostitution is indoors. In Germany, estimates say around 90%. And so about 75% of murders happened indoors. So yes, the streets are more dangerous, but still a lot is happening indoor. And most of the sex trade is there anyway. There are no safety mechanisms, not cameras, not anything else that can really make something reliably safe. About 40 of all murders happen in so-called apartment brothels. It can be the victim's private home, but usually it's not, although the women do live and sleep there. So a minority of women directly rent these out and permanently stay in the apartments, but a majority of them, especially migrant women with no work visa, they're more likely to move repeatedly on a usually like bi-weekly manner from city to city and from apartment to apartment, often under the control of organized crime, because sex buyers want what they call fresh meat, new place, new face all the time. Anecdotal evidence from around the world tells us that women who operate on the streets do develop some level of system of communicating with each other and warning each other in order to collectively avoid suspicious men. But this is more difficult for women who are in apartment brothels and might not be part of any system, might have just come to a knee, who also often don't speak German, or again, are just straight up under the control of traffickers. They are more socially isolated. So the moment that she opens that door, it's a complete stranger. It may already be too late, and she doesn't even stand a chance of a warning. A number of these victims also shared apartment brothels. Sometimes they're alone, but there's often 1 or 2, 3, 4 women in it. Just because there was another woman there, or even a so-called protector or a pimp, these are still not reliable protections from lethal violence. And there are several cases where if there were 2 women in an apartment together, he just kills both of them. Also murdered in hotels or in perpetrators' homes. And this would usually be what we call escorting, which is just a term to say that the sex buyer calls a number. He picks a woman from an online menu, usually, and then he orders her to wherever he pleases. So it might be a hotel or his private home. Either way, the location is most likely unfamiliar to her. She doesn't know the layout. She doesn't know possible escape routes. Crazy enough that anyone would have to plan that as part of their job, but she doesn't even have that option. She doesn't know what awaits her. And some of these escort agencies do keep client lists, but like I talked about with the case of Christina, even that doesn't prevent it. So we really, really need to stop romanticizing escorting. It's obviously, objectively, extremely dangerous to go to unknown locations to meet unknown men, and that's what escorting is. And then we have the infamous mega brothels in Germany, and we envision, wait, there's dozens and dozens or even hundreds of people in the building. Like, surely that has a safe option, right? We got cameras, panic buttons, bouncers on every exit. But yeah, the Project Sex Industry Kills recorded at least 13 known murders and murder attempts inside mega brothels since 2002. And there are many more that have been happening through the 80s and 90s. And yeah, we have the example of the Pascha in Cologne. Some people might know that one. There are 150 rooms. So theoretically, if they're all staffed, 150 women in them. And the owner was frequently invited into the German media to talk about prostitution and, you know, how we have a great model and how things are ethical and this is all fair, sex trade, blah, blah, blah. In 2003, a woman from Thailand was stabbed to death by a sex buyer inside the Pascha. And then this owner, who, you know, was parading around the media, promised better security. But not only was there human trafficking uncovered in 2004, so 1 year later, and there was at least 1 child found exploited in there, there were 2 more documented cases of women nearly being murdered by Johns, one in 2006, one in 2015. And the same Pascha chain also operates brothels in other cities, infamously in Salzburg in Austria, where an 18-year-old woman gave birth inside the brothel and then threw her child out the window in distress. Like, these are supposed to be the safest places, and every kind of crime against women and children that you can imagine has happened inside of them. Okay, I have a few more examples. I don't know if we need to hear all of them. For the German people, I can just say, you know, the Eros Center chain has been affected. One was even targeted in the 80s by a serial killer. So it was 1 mega brothel where a man just kept coming back, killing women over a 6-year time span. There's the Paradise, that's now infamous, that even made it into national news because of the systematic trafficking that existed basically the entire that it operated. And in 2016, a woman from Romania was shot to death, again by a regular John, in front of the brothel. Despite the availability of legal venues, even though we just saw they're not free of violence or trafficking, there are still illegal brothels in Germany and actually flourishing. So these are, again, these kind of apartment brothels, but they're not registered. Strip clubs that double as brothels illegally, spas and massage parlors. And so, for example, we've had 2 Asian women murdered in a massage parlor in Gelsenkirchen in 2017. And another case in a Thai massage parlor more recently, 1 or 2 years ago. So these kinds of Asian massage parlor trafficking, abuse, murders happens in Germany too, but somehow we don't know about it. Like we have this idea once it's legal, these venues will stop, right? Because you can just make a legal brothel, but it doesn't. It continues still, because that's how much the profiteers of this industry just don't give a damn about laws or human rights. I might skip a little bit on the section of how women are murdered because it's especially brutal, and I don't know if it's that insightful, if it really helps us understand the phenomenon so well to understand the details of how it's done. It's also difficult for me to read. Like I said, I've read a lot of stuff, but reading how women are murdered is definitely the worst thing I've ever done, and I have the last few years avoided going back over the details of that. And I only did it to write this article. I should maybe mention that it's one thing that's important, and the women behind sex industry kills highlight this in their study. It's not sufficient to keep out guns or knives from brothels. So sometimes at the entrance, somebody will actually, take a look at what are men bringing into the brothel. Many of these cases, men are using pillows, clothing items, or their bare hands. There's no policy to keep weapons out, or that's not enough. Most of these cases, men actually use other tools to murder. And so a number of victims, before they were killed, they were restricted in their freedom of movement by so-called BDSM practices. These are dangerous. It's dangerous for a woman in the sex trade to let a man, put ropes around her or various versions of that. I'm not going to go into the detail of that, just to understand the scope. Among the murderers are men who are the worst types of sadists or even necrophiles. So those are men who get a sexual kick, violence, up to the level of murder, and a necrophile is then someone who wants to rape a corpse. So this is, definitely the heaviest stuff I've ever worked with, and I appreciate you guys still being around to listen to this because I know it's really heavy. I'm not going to go into the details. I just want to say these things happen. A number of men, we live in the digital age, they film their crimes and they sometimes share it, right? So some of this is then turned into torture porn. And unsurprisingly, a number of men were addicted to pornography, and we know from the police investigations they were trying to recreate it, and they killed a woman in the process. Okay, let's see. Here's some gruesome details. I think I'm not going to read it out. I'm just going to summarize. Really important to understand, these cases are both murders, as in the victim dies, but it also includes attempted murder. And I mean, it must be hard. I hope none of us are really able to imagine what it's like to be nearly murdered. I think the PTSD goes without saying. But of course, the physical injuries can be really, really severe. So sometimes women are injured, knives, for example, and then they die from the consequences years later, or they have lifelong disability. And several cases of that. Okay, now I'm going to go into why. What are the motives of these men? So the real answer to why men murder women in prostitution, I would say, is misogyny, racism, entitlement, lack of empathy. Some of them have intense self-hatred, and then they direct it at the outside world. And in the cases of robbery, we have greed. And anything else they say, I would say, is justification, excuses, and trying to incite sympathy from a jury. Nonetheless, I'm going to outline some of these excuses just to explain how these men think, and also how society might sometimes end up encouraging their really twisted thinking and feed into the narratives. Men kill women in the sex trade because they see them as less than, right? One, because they're women, and two, because they're so-called loose women. So these murders are the worst consequence of an irrational, aggressive hatred towards women who are viewed by the perpetrator as devalued because she's had too much sexual contact with men. Or a lot of Johns think like this. Is very, very heavy on the forums and interviews. They say, these women exploit us. They exploit our natural urges, right, for their financial gain. How dare they? For some men, those are just, ugly comments online. But as we understand with other misogynistic ideologies, that can escalate, and clearly does escalate, into actual physical violence. Right? These men have the image of the woman in the sex trade as very shrewd and hardened, and also less sensitive to pain. And so we do know from studies even that a lot of Johns think women in the sex trade can't be raped. So using other kinds of violence in their mind also isn't that serious a crime, because she's just not really fully human to them. As is common when men murder women they have no personal relation to, many killers use the woman as a stand-in for a generalized hatred against women. So unresolved rage against an ex-partner, or they've been romantically rejected, and they go out frustrated and basically say, tonight I'm going to show it to some bitch. And it's really enraging how these men then get up in court and tell these stories, you know, sometimes crying, or their lawyer does, to incite sympathy from a jury. It's insane. And these all shouldn't matter, but unfortunately, some people take it seriously, including judges. So they tell stories of this personal pain they carry that's unrelated to the victim, right? Years of bullying, they lost their job. There are some cases of men who feared deportation, recent death of a loved one. These are the kinds of stories that men tell, even though they're completely irrelevant. And as many of you know, the man who murdered women in massage parlor brothels in Atlanta, a lot of the killers of women in German prostitution also feel the women in sex trade have done them some level of harm. So we have one example of a man who thought he had contracted HIV in a prostitution context, even though it turned out later he didn't even have HIV. But he thought he did. So he just went out and murdered a random woman. Again, many men feel like they were exploited because they had to pay too much. Again, this is mirrored in US research. Men are killing women because they're getting upset over pricing. So again, it can be the regular John who feels like he has spent 4 or 5 digit sums on one woman, and how dare she now change her mind or not obey, whatever. There are many men who feel cheated out of time. They're like, the woman rushed me too much, so I strangled her. Several men were angry because they had erectile dysfunction. That sent them into a murderous rage. And yet others attacked victims over sums as little as 20 euros. They found themselves unable to pay, and they were prepared to kill a woman before admitting it. And we have a lot of examples of what you might call escalated price haggling. That's a very strongly occurring motive in the narratives of these men. It turns into a fight while they're talking about how much is her so-called service worth. Yeah, there's a culture among sex buyers that holds up a male right to access women's bodies and seeks punishment of women who don't deliver after payment. So he has paid, she doesn't do what he expected, and yeah, he takes that as an excuse to become violent, up to, again, lethal violence. German sex buyers on their forums have a term for that, call it rip-off cunts. So again, it starts with this language, but that can escalate to bigger and more severe forms of violence. Repeatedly, perpetrators feel that women should be punished for assertiveness and outspokenness. Murderers have stated in court that they killed women for refusing anal sex or other specific acts. Women are also blamed and punished with lethal violence for making fun or simply observing, I mentioned this already, erectile dysfunction. Yeah, I'm lost for words on that. And obviously, women's behavior did not cause the murders. And like advising women in sex trade, or women in general, we're told just tiptoe around men's fragile egos. That's not the solution, right? These men carry a deep-seated hatred for themselves and the people around them, and they're looking for an excuse to take it out on someone and thereby reassert masculine control or something. And if it's not her laughing about his limp dick, then he'll find something else. He'll find an excuse, right? Maybe she didn't smile enough or moan enough or whatever. He'll come up with something. It's just an excuse. Men who were women's partners killed them for the same reason that men kill their girlfriends and wives, right? Entitlement, losing control over her body and life. A few men viewed their partners being in prostitution as cheating. That, again, would justify punishment. So while some are pimps, others are like, you get out of prostitution when I say you do, otherwise, yeah. Many, again, were former sex buyers or pimps. And before the murder, same as with other domestic violence cases, there was often stalking and other types of abuse. And these women were trying to escape, and the moment that they're trying to escape is when he decides he'd rather have her dead than lose her. In German sex buyer circles, men who believe themselves to be in a love relationship with a woman in the sex trade are known as Liebeskasper, which means a fool in love. So indicating that not even sex buyers themselves think genuine relationships. And the women who did the research for this, right, and wrote the study, they highlight a case of blaming of women killed under such circumstances, and they quote sex buyers. And this is regarding the case that I mentioned already of the Romanian woman shot in front of the Paradise mega brothel. Here are 2 quotes from German sex buyers on that case. One man says, "I'm actually surprised that this sort of thing doesn't happen more often. When a John stabs a hooker to death, she probably deserved it. the kind of hookers who not only rip you off, but enjoy playing with the feelings of unstable men. Well, they're literally playing with fire. Sometimes that means a smack in the face or a knife in the ribs. And another guy comments, in my opinion, the victim carries joint guilt for this whole drama. She should have either dropped that fool in love early and decisively, or continued the business relationship and provided a decent professional service. I mean, just in general, these forums are horrific, but you also see that going back and forth, whatever's convenient to the misogynist. When she's a worker, he'll call her a worker, right? Professional, servant, blah, blah. But then when it's about sexual entitlement or wanting to feel loved and cared for or whatever, which some men delude themselves, then they'll be mad that this didn't happen. On top of everything, yeah, patriarchal men or patriarchy in general is just allowed to exist with such complete contradictions and such violent, ugly ones. It's enraging. One excuse that actually worked for some perpetrators in court is that of the BDSM mishap. And those of you who followed the We Can't Consent to This campaign in Britain, you know about this. This happens to women outside of sex trade too. So he tells the court that the woman asked to be strangled. She wanted it for pleasure, blah, blah, blah. And he merely complied a little too hard and too long. And one man got 2 years probation for this crime, while if it was recognized as murder, he could get decades or life. No, okay, not surprising when it's pimp killing women, it's because they're no longer profitable or variations of that. As one case I talked about before, that's really heavy. This is one of the few cases that was actually so big it made it into, more media than just the tabloids. A lot of people were talking about this one, but it's kind of due to the youth of the victim and the level of brutality. It's not the only one. In 2002, a 19-year-old woman named Andrea was murdered by her pimps because she was sick with schizophrenia, to the point that she couldn't turn any profit for them anymore. But it's important to remember, again, it's not the only kind of case. And when it happens to a migrant woman who is too sick to work, she'll just be sent home to her home country and nobody even notices. So we only know about Andrea because she was German and there were like a few authorities looking out for her. So they noticed when she was gone. This will happen either being sent home or just straight up killed for migrant women and nobody will notice. And sometimes women end up in the crossfire of organized crime. So that's one woman who was killed by a car bomb that was intended for her pimp, or a girl who was shot by a man who also killed her pimp. Also, a number of these cases, right, are escalated robberies. So some robbers come to women's doors with the intention of taking money, and others are just sex buyers who, after the fact, decide, not only did I not want to pay for this, I'll actually just take all the money she's got here. And that's why we got so much advice for women. When you get the money from the John, put some of it on the nightstand, put some of it in the cupboard, put some of it under the bed, because this kind of robbery is so common. And some women who then fight the man or whatever, she's in his way, it can end up in a murder. And it's also very important that we stop perpetuating the myth that prostitution makes women so rich, they just, they're like bathing in cash. They carry small fortunes with them. There are a number of these cases where the robbers go into her apartment or whatever, and they expect to find all this money, and they don't, and they get really angry. We could do a little bit if we stopped telling everyone, these women are just sitting on all this money. It's not true, and it makes them targets. And a number of men murder women in the hopes of covering up rape. And like I mentioned, some just killed for pleasure. And some of these, this is some of the most upsetting stuff for me. Some of these murders are straight up male bonding rituals, right? These are men who are in very brutalized worlds where proving to each other how dominant or masculine, violent, whatever, we go rob, rape, and murder women. That's a thing that does still happen in Germany. Finally, it's safe to assume that many killers were encouraged by the assumption that they're less likely to be caught because of the continued low social status and high degree of isolation of most women in the sex trade. So in general, I should say German police did take these cases seriously, and they do have a reasonable clearance rate, at least from these cases that I could see. We don't know how many ended up cold. Of course, there could be a number. There is a practical barrier to identifying killers because there's such a large pool of suspects often. So there are cases where the police is testing hundreds or even thousands of men's DNA in one area to find the perpetrator. Unfortunately, that's inherent to the sex trade. Again, doesn't change with legislation. that big pool of suspects because of the large number of sex buyers. And that's, again, observed in other countries. And again, it's insane to me that I mentioned at the start, German Bureau of Criminal Investigations is not tracking these murders by numbers. They're not collecting the data because they say that'll stigmatize women or somehow make them seem like easier targets, right? But the men who commit this, they're often close up to the milieu. It doesn't matter. They don't know about any bureau's statistics. It doesn't matter. They're up close to the milieu. They know what women's lives are like. It's not like I don't understand this logic that not talking about the violence will make it less so, or will get rid of the stigma. And then if we all just view women as empowered, then they will become like, I don't understand it. It boggles my mind. And the only people I think that are helped by not talking about this are just the perpetrators. Prostitution in Germany is not new. It's been documented since Roman times, basically. So sex buying has been for a very long time just an accepted facet of society. It's been normalized. It's been practiced by male elites and commoners alike for a really, really long time. Brothel keeping has basically always been semi-legal. It's not just recently. It's just been clarified in law 20 years ago. And it's only the seller who has been historically marginalized, stigmatized, and targeted by industry insiders and outsiders, right? So we have to really untangle the views on and the interests of these different groups. When we speak of sex work, it often subsumes the interests of profiteers, sex buyers, and women selling as like under one umbrella. But these are separate groups, very much so. Yeah, all that happened in 2002 in Germany was giving its final stamp of approval to all these parties. Even though I would argue very strongly the law mostly benefits sex buyers and pimps and actually comes with burdens for women. So the state labeling prostitution a regular industry, casting sex buyers as regular consumers, it does not prevent murders of women in the sex trade. It does not stop male entitlement to female bodies. I'm very sure it actually exacerbates it, right? Men feel they're customers, right? So they're kings. They're just paying for a service. Now they can expect it to be carried out to their satisfaction. And like I mentioned, perceived non-compliance is an extremely common excuse for murder. The sex seller, the woman in prostitution, may no longer be seen as a criminal, but still seen by wider society and definitely by sex buyers as not fully human. Yeah, legality doesn't alter power dynamics in the industry significantly. We still have mostly local white men with excess income purchasing access to socially isolated, impoverished, mostly migrant women. Legality says that these women's marginalization just doesn't matter. There's no great harm done in paying to access someone, even, like we heard, women in really, really visible distress. And men get away with raping women in the sex trade still all the time. And is it surprising them that many of them think that nobody will care about a missing or dead, what they call hooker? So legality does not dissuade organized crime from profiting. Instead, they become semi-legal businessmen. And according to experts, they really do control most of the milieu, and then they're invited into our talk shows. That still happens in Germany, even now. Safety mechanisms, even in legal licensed brothels, fail routinely, and women all across the sex trade, in every part of it, from the streets to escorting, are given advice how not to get raped and murdered on the job, which means they're being gaslit into thinking this is normal or acceptable, and if something bad happens, it's their fault for not being professional enough. Since even our government has bought this narrative that speaking critically of the sex trade equals speaking bad of women in it, we don't even have official statistics on this. Nonetheless, a little bit of hope at the end. The debate is evolving. There are more and more voices calling for change on this. But many people still view these murders as tragic outliers, so not as culminations of exploitative systems of power, age-old patriarchy. And it's a question of whether we let them. The study that I mentioned at the beginning, first ever study into this issue, it came out a year ago, and it didn't make a big splash in the media. I found that really depressing. It should have. It's still, people in Germany still don't know that more than 100 women have been killed since the sex trade was liberalized in 2002. Most don't know these women's names. So we still have work to do. I also think it's important that we get international pressure on Germany, because as many of you might know, a lot of the time governments don't act until they're shamed into it by the international community. That's why I do this work in English as well, so that you, the international community, know not to copy us, and also to help pressure our government to change the laws. Like all of this legal makes it safe. If anything, the fact that murder is still basically an occupational hazard should disprove that. If nothing else, at least this should show us that this is a violent, inhumane industry that can't be reformed. It has to be abolished. We can talk about how, but there's no way that we can sell this to future generations of women and girls as just a job.